Hello and welcome to a Hurt on podcast, our little corner of the Wild West. My name is Isaiah.
And my name is Riley. Isaiah, what would happen to you if all of your debts were forgiven? It would be pretty life-changing, right?
Yeah.
Imagine if all the debts of your entire country were forgiven, how that would change like you and your country and how your government feels about money. Well, that happened to a lot of countries in generally the year 2000 and through the 2000s. It was called Jubilee 2000. And I think we should start preparing for it to happen again. So,
I can't even picture how forgiving a country's debt would affect me as an individual, especially if imagine if America's debt was just forgiven. That's trillions of dollars. I
yeah.
don't even understand the ramifications of that at all.
Yeah, I'm no expert on international banking
Really?
or how debt actually works, because it sounds crazy when you think about $15 trillion in debt or whatever we're at now.
Right.
That's not even a real number. No one has that amount of money. We could never pay that back.
Right.
Well, we could. Some countries have slowly worked. I think Japan paid off a lot of debt after World War II. Anyway, the concept of Jubilee 2000 and what I think should happen again is rich countries they were the lenders to poorer countries, largely in Africa and South America. So the way that these countries, as far as I understand it, became so indebted to France and Japan and the US and Germany and Britain and those kinds of countries is all of those countries that I just listed advanced first. And they said, hey, you in Africa, you in South America, you've got a lot of gems or minerals or good farming land or whatever we decided that we wanted to do in their area. And we basically said, either we're going to come in and force you to mine diamonds for us, or you need to do it so cheaply that it's essentially free. And so all of these countries took out loans to build the infrastructure to support their suppliers,
Right.
or to be the suppliers. And they still have not been able to pay that back for a multitude of reasons. Partly because we, the West, don't pay as fairly as we probably should to be able to repay those,
Sure.
for them to repay us on those loans in the traditional sense. So this is a big problem. It still is, but it was a lot in the 80s and 90s, and it was inhibiting less developed countries' ability to grow and develop and create a better, more healthy lifestyle for their citizens. So the idea was, let's persuade a lot of these rich countries who own the something. Own the debt,
Yeah.
I guess, to just forgive it. To just say, you don't need to pay it anymore. It's a forgiveness without strings attached, I guess. And this did happen. And I think I saw different numbers. I think some of them were adjusted for inflation, but somewhere between $90 and $130 billion in debt to, I think, 36 countries, or actually, it might be more than 30 or 40 countries had either partially or all of their debt forgiven because it was owned by other countries that maybe didn't need it, or at least could be persuaded to cancel that debt.
Which is a lot. And to me, $1 billion is still kind of an unimaginable amount of money.
Yeah.
I think anything past $10 million, I just kind of lose all comprehension for how much that actually is.
Definitely.
So that's a significant amount of money.
It's a significant amount of money, and it's significant to us who have statistically some of the highest incomes in the world.
Right.
So imagine Zambia having their billions of dollars of debt forgiven to a population that makes a lot less money than we did, or our counterparts in the 90s did. So it's even more impactful that way, which I think is kind of one of the cool things about it is like maybe to America it's not a huge deal to forgive like $1 billion in debt because that's a 1/1500th of what we have.
Right.
But to some other countries that like allows them to build better hospitals or more roads or more grocery stores or whatever. So I think that it's kind of, I don't know the right term, but it's like a dollar here goes a lot farther than it does over here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that utilizing that and kind of using that as a tool is pretty cool.
Yeah. And you can just build like less missiles or something, It's
Yeah.
easy.
Yeah. That's a whole other conversation. I don't think we've described really what Jubilee means or is. Why don't you explain it?
So Jubilee is a concept from the Bible. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of old. But basically it was every 50 years, there was like a mandate to forgive debts and to return. You're supposed to return to like where you were born, return to like your family's land.
Yeah, I think it was like if you lost land because of bankruptcy or an untimely death or something, that is like rectified and you are given back the land that you had to sell to pay for your debts. Or if you were enslaved because of a huge debt or because you were like literally just born a poor person and you had to be a slave, you were essentially freed after 50 years and given your freedom. So it's a lot about like community reconciliation and like not holding on to things for an unjust amount of time.
Right. Because like land ownership was like you could own your family's land and it stayed in your family. But like if you bought someone else's land, as soon as Jubilee hits, like it's theirs again. And so there wasn't like a perpetuous land ownership like there is now. Like someone could sit on land right now for like hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And it's just locked down in like a trust or whatever.
That's how some of the like rich people of the world are rich now, is because their great granddad was able to buy 5,000 acres of land in Scotland or whatever, and now they own 12 towns.
Right. And so it's just interesting how like the paradigm is so different, because back then it was like every 50 years there's kind of like a cultural reset and everything kind of gets leveled again. And it was interesting because it's in Leviticus, in the same like area of Leviticus, it kind of talks about they wanted every 7 years to be like a specific like set aside year. And in the 7th year, they weren't allowed to like plant their fields and like grow stuff. And so some of that kind of points back to like Exodus and Joseph. And there's like the like kind of a metaphor there, I guess, kind of pointing back towards that story. Mm-hmm. But scientifically, it's really bad for the soil to be farmed on the same crop year after year after year. It depletes the soil. And so this, even though for them it is like a, pointing back towards this story of their culture and their history.
It's kind of like a Sabbath.
Right.
Instead of every 7th day, it's every 7th year.
Right. And it is something that's healthy for the soil. Mm-hmm. And it actually prevents their fields from becoming these like sterile, unfruitful places.
Or ridden with disease.
Right.
And a small theological aside here, but a lot of Leviticus is mandates that don't make a lot of sense to us,
right?
But they were basically just to like help keep God's chosen people healthy,
right?
And like have the ability to thrive,
right?
And I think that this was one of them. Like a healthy community forgives, and a healthy community like helps each other become financially stable,
right? And
that's kind of the original idea of Jubilee. And so the Jubilee movement that happened it was called Jubilee 2000, but it really happened from like 1994 to 2015. So it was this whole thing, and it's continuing to go forward. It was spurred on a lot by like different religious communities, but also like Bono was a big part of it, and he thought that it was really cool, and apparently he was very like persuasive and involved in convincing some of these political leaders to consider this. And so it really was like an international movement towards like global reconciliation,
Sure.
which I think is really awesome.
Yeah.
I love that word, reconciliation.
Reconciliation.
Anyway, all that history aside, look it up more if you want to. But I want to decide if this should happen again. The idea is every 50 years, right?
Right.
So if it happened in 2000, it's 2024 now. We're about halfway there to needing another round of this. And I think we are. I think enough happens globally in 50 years that it makes sense to totally reevaluate who needs support, who's been taken advantage of, who's holding all the money, and to kind of like redistribute it a little bit. Call me a socialist, communist, but I think that is just a kind thing to do.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because pushes like this movement are towards like governments, right? And towards nations.
Mm-hmm.
And so the cynical part of me is like, of course it worked because none of these people were actually like sacrificing as much, you know, because it's like spread out over like the country, and like the government is kind of a big entity that can absorb a lot of stuff, and like it's the pain of that is spread across so many people that it's felt less, I think. So to me it's like, well, yeah, but like for stuff that would be like more specific towards just global redistribution of wealth kind of in like a larger scale, like, because this is great, but it's still like a small amount of money compared to like the inequality of like wealth distribution.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking at Jubilee and like wanting it to be fair, like the richest people need to like be a part of that, and it has to like be a sacrifice on their part too, to an extent. So
well, we are the richest people. We're not just talking about like Elon Musk, who actually has billions of dollars. We're talking about you and I saying, please take some of our tax dollars and donate it to other countries that need it.
Right. Which is like cool and like great. And I think that should happen. But the reality is our purchasing power and our ability to make a difference through sacrifice is way diminished compared to like, you know, the top 0.1% of the world. And so like, I don't know, even like Bono, like that's great. And he did a lot of like political activism like this, but he's still involved. Like a rich person, and there's still like the kind of inequality there, you know? So
yeah,
that's tough. I don't know. It's something that like could kind of be compared as like everyone who has a student loan wants student loans to be forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
But no one wants to pay for it. No one wants to like let those debts go. And this is like that on a large scale, you know, like globally, basically.
Yeah. I mean, to take that example, when you say you want student debts canceled, what that probably means is any debt that's not directly owned by the government is just paid out by the government.
Right.
So it's not like the lending company gets less money. They still get all their money. In fact, they get it in a lump sum and it's a guaranteed payment when some people defer on their loans. But it's the government that would end up paying for it.
Right.
So I can understand why it's controversial and complex. I think they all have to be taken in the context of their own conversation, which is probably why it took, 12 years to decide what all countries get what amount of debt forgiven. Because it wasn't just everyone in Africa has no debt anymore, obviously. It was very systematized, and the IMF and the World Bank were very involved.
Right.
And so I think personally that it is a problem because we benefit from other countries having to take out loans that they can't pay. Like we can buy affordable electronics and batteries and all sorts of stuff that is not typically made in the first world, because we in the first world are still taking advantage of people who don't make a livable wage, or other countries depleting their natural resources at the detriment to their nature,
right?
So that we can have cobalt in our batteries or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah, and I think like from that regard, there's also like an environmental benefit because, in the Industrial Revolution, that's kind of where pollution got really bad and where stuff started to kind of get intense.
Mm-hmm.
And for us now, it's like, oh, well, we need to like be green and like whatever. And we've kind of passed that point to where we're kind of moving in generally the right direction. Like we don't just pump coal out constantly out of every single smokestack we possibly can anymore.
We're making improvements, probably not as fast as we need to,
Right.
but it is at least largely understood that change is needed.
Right. But in the third world, they're still kind of in that, phase where depleting natural resources is their way to get ahead economically.
Absolutely.
And so it's tough because if we come in and we say like, hey, we have to do this and this climate wise, they're like, well, we can't afford to do that. Like we have to keep doing what we're doing, And
Yeah.
so this could be like a solution in that area too of like, okay, well, like don't worry about these debts. Like you can focus on advancing technologically and like worrying about all of this stuff. And that benefits everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's a similar argument, since you brought it up, about who is responsible for making changes in climate change,
Mhm.
and who needs to be held most responsible. And if it does take a lot of money, like if we decide to build 1 million of those machines that suck carbon out of the air,
Right.
who's going to pay for them? And currently, like as of today, China and other like rising powers are the largest emitters of greenhouse gas and other environmental factors that deteriorate our world. But that's only as of the last like 15 or 20 or 30 years. If you look at the whole scale of all of human time, it's by far Western powers
right.
who have like caused the most long-term damage. So like who should be responsible? The people who do it the most now or the people who did the most over time?
Right.
That's I guess a separate solution, but I agree that they could be linked. And to say like, forget about the money that you owe us. Instead, spend that money that you would have spent repaying us on better infrastructure for your company so that people can take the train to work and not have to drive 200 cars or whatever. And that does sound small, but I think over time that changes the mindset of like, rather than it's an us versus them, like who should we be pointing the finger at to say you're responsible for solving climate change, to say like, hey, we'll pitch in, we'll forgive some of your debt, we will start working on our technology, you use that money to start working on your technology and improving your ecosystem, and we'll all contribute together.
Yeah.
And I think that it is a huge thing to forgive billions of dollars of debt, but we spend way more than that on a lot of other things.
Yeah.
So,
and like if you think about it, money's not even real,
Right.
So I don't know, I was just thinking about how like so much of the debt that's like we finance our debt and we make payments on our debt as a country just through like printing money.
Yeah.
So like we pay off our debt with things that didn't cost us anything.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing happened, I think, in Argentina around the turn of the millennium, is they were in a lot of debt. So to pay for it, they just printed a bunch of money and it caused hyperinflation and it destroyed their economy.
Right.
And it arguably did more damage than if they, I don't know, had just like cut funding to something, schools, the military, healthcare, whatever. I mean, not that those things should be necessarily cut, but they could have theoretically paid their debt in another way,
or even just defaulted. Like at this point, like their country's in shambles, anyway, and people like don't want to work because their money's just going to be worthless immediately, and people will store their value in goods, and it's just like the whole economy is falling apart. Like society is breaking down in like a core aspect, and like it doesn't have to, it's just
right.
Money's not real.
It is kind of funny when you think about it that way. Like, why we wanted a bunch of money from, I think it was Argentina, but forgive me if I'm wrong. We wanted them to pay us back.
Venezuela, I think.
Venezuela?
Yeah.
Okay. Whoever. this is probably the case in many countries. We expected them to pay the loan that we gave them back, but in the pressure of that expectation, they put themselves in a situation where they won't be able to pay it back anyway.
Right.
So if you just forgive it before it causes the whole country to fall apart, then they don't have to fall apart, and they can eventually like contribute to the greater good of humanity.
Yeah. The downside with all of this is it kind of just ignores corruption, and that was a huge part of Venezuela's like currency issue, is because so much of that was to like keep financing the government and keep the president in power and stuff like that. So there was so much corruption that also led to that point. There wasn't like they were like, oh, we're trying really hard to pay back our debt and we really can't, so we're just going to print more money. You know, like
Yeah.
there's the corruption aspect too, and that's why stuff like this, you know, it can't just be every country is debt free. You know, there has to be investigations into the government and kind of an understanding of how that money is going to be spent, and like it's just a very like case by case thing that needs, you know, time and effort put into kind of figuring out what the best use of that is.
Yeah. I agree with you that it's incredibly complicated, and we are not even sort of close to experts on it.
Yeah.
But I think that that's where the international community as a whole, I don't know a lot about the corruption or not corruption of the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund is, but I think it makes sense to have other countries involved, you know, like
Yeah.
maybe all of NATO gets together and says, we hold most of the debts that are owed, so I'm going to say here publicly that I'm going to forgive this country of $10 billion or whatever. And then there's at least an accountability among the international community that that country now owes America or whoever $10 billion less.
Yeah.
Even if that's all just theoretical.
Right.
Even if it's all just on paper and no one was going to pay them each other back in the first place.
Yeah.
That's where like the economics of it gets confusing, and you wonder like, is America ever going to pay its debt? And
No.
like, who owns that debt? Partly companies and partly like countries.
Right.
But like, I don't know, like BlackRock and the 12 people that run it
Yeah.
probably own part of our own country and other countries. I'm gonna get on a soapbox, and I don't want to. So let's move on.
We're gonna start a new segment called Riley's Communist Corner.
Potentially. We got Riley's Crunchy Corner and Riley's let's do Socialist Corner, even though it doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well. Okay, just yes or no. Should we start preparing to do something similar in 2050? Jubilee 2050. And by we, I mean all rich countries.
Probably. That's not a yes or no,
Okay.
I guess. I would say yes. But I think there's lots of other things that probably could be focused on before we get to that point too.
Yeah.
There's lots of problems in the world.
Yeah. It's difficult to decide like, well, this problem needs to be solved before this problem, or that this problem, if we were to solve it, would then contribute to the solution of this problem. Like if there was a straightforward answer, we probably would have figured it out by now.
Yeah.
But I think that the spirit of reconciliation can't go wrong.
That sounds like a plane name. The spirit of reconciliation.
I'll let you start that business without me.
Okay. No, I think you're right. And I think like generally it's a good thing to aim for, but we also, you know, in 2050 we might be just like scavenging through a wasteland using bottle caps for money.
And then everyone's debt will be forgiven.
Yeah,
because
money's not real.
No, money's not real, and there's no organization left to uphold those debts.
So it's like Jubilee Apocalypse Edition.
Here's hoping. Thank you for listening to I Heard It on a Podcast. We've got new episodes every Monday, wherever you find podcasts, including YouTube.
Yeah, and if you'd like to connect with us, we're on Instagram and Threads, and you can also email us if you want to chat with us at hello@ihearditonapodcast.com.